April 5, 1945. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Hoshi. Rain lashed against the windows as staff officers of Admiral Sumu Toyota assembled around the operations table. Before them lay the latest dispatch from Imperial General Headquarters, a directive whose contents left no room for optimism. Operation Tenno was to be executed, a surface special attack targeting Okinawa. The mission assigned the battleship Yamato to advance to the shore and act as a stationary defensive stronghold, engaging enemy forces until the ship was inevitably destroyed. Vice Admiral Ryonosuke Kusaka set his teacup aside and picked up the secured telephone, preparing to coordinate the details of this final sortie. The force designated for the operation consisted of 1 battleship, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers, an overwhelming understrength contingent facing the full might of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Opposing them were formidable American carriers, including the USS Bunker Hill, USS Enterprise, and USS Essex. What Japanese commanders could not fully anticipate was the scale of the aerial assault they would face. It would become the largest concentrated carrier strike ever conducted against a surface warship in history. Lessons from the Pacific War had made clear that battleships no longer ruled the waves. Their immense size and firepower made them prominent targets rather than decisive instruments of naval supremacy. By this point, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Second Fleet had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former power. Yamato remained the fleet's only operational battleship. Her sister ship, Musashi, had been destroyed 6 months prior in the Sibuyan Sea. The converted aircraft carrier Shinano lasted only 10 days post-commissioning before an American submarine ended her career. Meanwhile, the USS Bunker Hill plowed through the Pacific at speeds reaching 25 knots, her Essex-class displacement totaling 27,100 tons. Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitscher observed intelligence reports from the Flag Bridge, directing Task Force 58, which contained 386 aircraft spread across 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers. From his command aboard the Bunker Hill, Mitscher controlled a force optimized for projecting U.S. air power over great oceanic distances. The strike group included F-6 Hellcats for fighter cover, SB-2C Helldivers for dive bombing, and TBF Avengers equipped with the Mark 13 aerial torpedo. The Mark 13 had been refined through 3 years of combat experience and addressed the shortcomings of earlier models that had frequently malfunctioned. The upgraded torpedo could be released at speeds of 260 knots from an altitude of 800 feet, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. Pilots had learned to concentrate attacks on a single side of Japanese vessels to induce a critical list, overwhelming their internal counter-flooding mechanisms. Commander James D. Jimmy Ramage, Air Group Commander aboard Enterprise, had meticulously studied Japanese ship designs and could reproduce Yamato's armor layout from memory. A native of Waterloo, Iowa, with an aeronautical engineering degree, Ramage knew that the ship could only be sunk by coordinated strikes. Multiple torpedo impacts below the main armor belt paired with targeted bomb hits to neutralize anti-aircraft positions. The mission's success hinged on precision, synchronized attacks, and overwhelming numerical superiority. On board the Yamato, Captain Kosaku Aruga examined the operation orders repeatedly. The following day, April 6th, the battleship would refuel at Tokuyama Depot, taking on approximately 3,400 tons of fuel oil. Despite strict instructions to provide only enough for a one-way mission, depot personnel quietly supplied 60% of the ship's fuel capacity instead of the 40% originally authorized, a small act of pragmatic defiance amid the final stages of the war. Although the Yamato carried sufficient fuel for an economical round trip, any extended combat maneuvers would quickly deplete its reserves. Vice Admiral Aruga, with prior experience commanding destroyers at Midway, had witnessed firsthand how American dive bombers destroyed the carriers Kagi and Kaga. He fully understood the destructive potential of carrier-based aircraft against ships that lacked air cover. The Yamato, with a full load displacement of 72,890 tons, was powered by 12 boilers driving 4 steam turbines. Her crew numbered 3,332 personnel, all of whom had survived previous air assaults in the late Skilf, submarine encounters in the Philippine Sea, and near misses during the March raids on Kure. Despite this resilience, the battleship's primary vulnerability remained unchanged since the attack on Pearl Harbor, a concentrated air assault from multiple vectors. As American carriers approached their interception point, they formed 3 distinct task groups. Task Group 5.81 to the north, Task Group 5.83 to the east, and Task Group 5.84 returning from refueling, moving to join the formation. Each carrier deployed reconnaissance aircraft in widening box search patterns. Radar operators rotated in 4-hour shifts, scrutinizing screens cluttered with misleading echoes from wavetops and rain showers. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor, responsible for coordinating the air operations, had been managing aerial interceptions across the Pacific for nearly 20 months. His hands moved with practiced precision across the radio controls, orchestrating the complex air operations. Launch cycles every 90 minutes, combat air patrols at 3 altitudes, and strike formations assembling at pre-assigned coordinates. The worsening weather added another layer of difficulty, with cloud bases dropping to 3,000 feet and visibility fluctuating between 2 and 10 miles amid sporadic rain squalls. On April 6, 1945, at 15:20 hours, the Yamato Task Force departed Tokuyama Harbor. The formation consisted of 10 ships, led by the light cruiser Yahagi, followed by destroyers, with the Yamato bringing up the rear. The operation reflected a personal request from the Emperor, who had questioned, "What are the Navy's efforts to defend Okinawa?" The mission, widely recognized as futile, symbolized loyalty rather than strategic viability. Vice Admiral Seiichi Itoto, commanding from Yamato's bridge, initially resisted the order. Only upon being informed of the Emperor's expectations did he comply. As the task force navigated Bungo Strait, the narrow channel between Kyushu and Shikoku, 2 U.S. submarines were already in position. Commander John Joseph Foote of USS Threadfin detected the Japanese formation on radar at approximately 17:45 hours, 10 vessels moving at 22 knots on a 240-degree heading. Foote surfaced briefly to transmit a contact report in clear text, prioritizing speed of communication over security, despite anticipating Japanese interception. Further south, USS Hackleback, under Commander Frederick Edward Janey, assumed surveillance duties as the Japanese force entered the East China Sea. Janey transmitted 4 detailed position reports overnight, despite the protective maneuvers of Japanese destroyers. By dawn on April 7th, weather conditions had deteriorated further, cloud cover at 1,500 feet and visibility reduced to roughly 5 miles in rain squalls. At 600 hours, 6 fighters from Kyushu arrived to provide the promised air cover, remaining for a limited 4-hour window until 1,000. Positioned at 15,000 feet above the cloud layer, these aircraft offered negligible defense against low-altitude torpedo assaults. Admiral Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet,
had instructed his battleships to prepare for a surface engagement. 6 modern U.S. battleships, equipped with radar-directed 16-inch guns, could target a single Japanese battleship already low on fuel. However, Vice Admiral Mitcher, acting independently of Spruance, decided to launch carrier-based strikes. At 6:57 hours on April 7th, the destroyer Asashimo reported engine difficulties and began to lag behind the formation. The stage was set for the largest naval confrontation yet, as Yamato, heavily armed but increasingly vulnerable, faced overwhelming American air power. Captain Hisa Kotaki, in command of Destroyer Division 21 aboard the Asashimo, attempted emergency repairs after sustaining damage, but the severity of the impairment exceeded what the crew could manage at sea. The destroyer gradually settled by the stern as the rest of the task force continued its course toward Okinawa.
By 10 o'clock, task groups 58-1 and 58-3 commenced their air assault. The operation involved an exceptionally large strike force, 132 fighter aircraft, 50 dive bombers, and 98 torpedo planes, all launching from 11 carriers to converge on a single strategic target. The fighters' mission was to suppress the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. Dive bombers approached from multiple vectors to divide the defensive fire, while torpedo bombers synchronized their attack runs to strike the same side of the ship, maximizing damage potential. Meanwhile, PBM Mariner seaplanes maintained observation from beyond the reach of anti-aircraft guns, relaying continuous positional updates via radio. At 12:20, lookouts on the Yamato identified the incoming American strike. Dark shapes appeared from the clouds and grew steadily larger as they approached. Anti-aircraft crews readied their weapons, elevating the guns and tracking the aircraft while awaiting permission to engage. 12 minutes later, at 12:32, Yamato began firing her main battery. 9 18.1-inch guns launched Sanki anti-aircraft shells, each weighing 3,200 pounds and designed to detonate at a set distance, dispersing incendiary fragments into the air. These shells, however, were relatively easy for the pilots to evade, as they could adjust altitude between bursts. The enormous guns, firing at a maximum of once per minute in this defensive role, were challenged by waves of American aircraft arriving every few seconds. The first organized attack commenced at 12:35. Aircraft from USS Bennington and USS Hornet divided into separate groups to strike simultaneously. Through intermittent rain and sea spray, Yamato's immense scale was apparent. 863 feet in length, with a towering superstructure rising 150 feet above the waterline. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every gun position, forming a dense lethal network of projectiles and tracers. At 12:37, the Yamato suffered its first torpedo hit on the port side near the aft secondary battery, producing a water column reaching approximately 100 feet. 2 minutes later, a second torpedo struck near the midship area. Soon after, a 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the deck close to the aft 6.1-inch turret, igniting fires that would persist until the ship's eventual sinking. Damage control teams attempted to stabilize the vessel by flooding compartments on the starboard side to counteract the growing list, but subsequent hits arrived faster than crews could respond. Simultaneously, the Asashimo, already impaired by engine problems, encountered aircraft from USS San Jacinto. Restricted in maneuverability, the destroyer sustained multiple bomb and torpedo strikes. The ship was ultimately lost, with all 326 crew members, including Captain Kotaki, perishing in the attack. No survivors were retrieved from the initial attacks. At 12:43, the Japanese destroyer Hamikaze suffered a direct hit to her bridge from an aerial bomb, resulting in the deaths of her captain and the majority of her command team. Severely damaged and ablaze, the vessel lost all control and was ultimately sunk by follow-up torpedo strikes. A total of 242 personnel perished aboard. Simultaneously, the light cruiser Yahagi came under assault from aircraft launched by 3 separate U.S. carriers. The cruiser endured numerous bomb and torpedo impacts, leaving her immobile and engulfed in flames. By 1300 hours, the battleship Yamato had sustained at least 5 torpedo strikes on her port side, forcing a 15-degree list despite extensive counter-flooding efforts.
Her maximum speed dropped to 18 knots. A second wave of attackers was already assembling, consisting of approximately 100 aircraft from task groups 58.1 and 58.3. These fresh aviators, fully armed, were set to strike a crippled behemoth that could no longer maneuver effectively. The torpedo squadrons executed coordinated attacks with practiced precision, approaching from multiple bearings and concentrating their assaults on the port side. At 1342, Yamato absorbed 3 additional torpedo hits along the port flank. The ship's list worsened to 20 degrees, and water infiltrated previously watertight compartments through damaged hatches. The assistant damage control officer reported to Captain Aruga that counterflooding measures were no longer feasible as all voids on the starboard side had been filled. Vice Admiral Ito recognized the futility of continuing Operation Tango. At 1350, he ordered its cancellation and signaled the surviving destroyers to commence rescue operations. Radio communication, however, had been disabled, leaving only visual signaling through smoke and spray as a means of coordination. At 1402, Captain Aruga commanded the crew to abandon ship, although the deck's 30-degree tilt made movement extremely hazardous. Sailors slid uncontrollably into the sea, while many remained trapped below as hatches jammed and compartments flooded. The Emperor's portrait was removed from the bridge and entrusted to a junior officer with explicit instructions to survive. Executive Officer Captain Jiro Nomura attempted to persuade Aruga to leave, but the captain refused, insisting Nomura save himself. Aruga secured himself to the compass binnacle, determined to remain aboard until the end. Vice Admiral Ito similarly retreated to his cabin, declining to evacuate despite repeated entreaties. At 1407, a torpedo struck the starboard side, the only hit that side sustained during the entire engagement. Its impact was negligible compared to the ship's already critical 35-degree list. Crew members leapt from the high side, falling more than 60 feet into the water. The colossal 18.1-inch gun turrets, each weighing 2,774 tons, began to detach from their mountings. By 1414, the battleship had heeled completely onto her side, moving forward at several knots despite being on her beam. Inside, hundreds remained trapped in compartments that had become fatal enclosures. 3 minutes later, the forward magazines detonated in a cataclysmic explosion visible 160 kilometers away in Kaiyu. The resulting mushroom cloud soared 20,000 feet, breaking through the cloud layer above. The blast disrupted nearby U.S. aircraft, forcing some out of control and causing minor damage to others too close to the detonation. In the aftermath, Yamato had vanished entirely, leaving only scattered debris and oil as testimony to the destruction of the world's largest battleship. Of her 3,332-man crew, only 276 survived. Vice Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and most senior officers perished with the vessel. Rescue operations were conducted by the destroyers Yukaze and Fuyuzuki, who retrieved survivors despite persistent air assaults. Crew members threw all available flotation devices overboard to aid those struggling in the water. Meanwhile, the destroyer Kasumi, heavily damaged with her bow destroyed, was scuttled by torpedoes from Fuyuzuki to prevent further risk.
On the fateful day of the battle, the Japanese fleet faced catastrophic losses. The cruiser Isukaze, along with the battleship Yamato, was scuttled and rendered useless, joining the growing list of ships lost. At 1405, the light cruiser Yahagi, after valiantly holding out against insurmountable odds, sank, adding to the toll. The outcome of the engagement was nothing short of devastating for the Imperial Navy. Of the 10 ships involved, 6 were sunk. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors perished in the clash, while the American side suffered comparatively lighter losses, 10 aircraft and 12 crew members. This stark disparity in casualties underscored the effectiveness of the American naval strategy. In a mere 2 hours, carrier-based aviation had accomplished what would have been nearly impossible for battleships to achieve in a full day of intense combat. The American victory was a testament to the refinement of naval air power, an epitome of carrier warfare doctrine. It was evident that the coordination of multiple carriers with their synchronized strikes had overwhelmed the defenses of the Japanese fleet.
Furthermore, the precision targeting of vital areas on enemy ships highlighted the tactical sophistication of the American forces. This battle, which took place 3.5 years after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, marked the fulfillment of the early predictions by air power advocates. The psychological toll on the Imperial Navy was immense. The loss of Yamato was symbolic on multiple levels. Not only was she one of Japan's most formidable ships, but her name also held deep cultural significance. Yamato was the ancient poetic designation for Japan itself, and her destruction signified more than just a military defeat. It symbolized the collapse of the spirit of the nation. Admiral Toyoda, reflecting on the operation's failure, would later remark that the loss of Yamato and the disastrous outcome of Operation Tango effectively marked the end of the Imperial Navy's capability to fight. The success of the American forces was aided significantly by intelligence. American codebreakers, by this point in the war, had penetrated Japanese communications and were able to intercept crucial naval orders before many Japanese commanders had even received them. This intelligence allowed for precise planning, such as pre-positioning submarines and refining search patterns to intercept the enemy fleet. As a result, the element of surprise, so often crucial in naval engagements, was entirely absent for the Japanese. The disparity in training between the two sides was also a decisive factor. In 1945, American pilots had an average of 300 hours of flight training, far surpassing the 100 hours typically received by their Japanese counterparts. Furthermore, American squadrons were rotated back home after combat tours, allowing them to replenish and train new pilots, while the Japanese squadrons remained in constant combat until they were completely wiped out. The aftermath of the battle would go on to influence naval thinking across the world in the post-war period. Every major navy would scrutinize the engagement, realizing the obsolescence of battleships in the face of modern air power. There was a newfound recognition of the need for stronger anti-aircraft defenses, as well as the importance of radar and communication systems, which had proven as vital as traditional armament like guns and armor in determining the outcome of the conflict.
The battle had far-reaching consequences that reshaped naval strategy and laid the foundation for post-war naval construction. The supremacy of air power had been demonstrated beyond question, and the entire nature of naval warfare would never be the same. Admiral Mitzer's after-action report underscored the crucial role of coordination in the success of military operations. The simultaneous launches of strikes from 11 aircraft carriers required flawless synchronization to avoid interference with each other's missions. The lessons gained from this complex endeavor would be applied during the Korean War 5 years later. Personal accounts from those involved added depth to the tragedy of the situation. Mitsuro Yoshida, one of the few surviving officers from the Yamato's bridge, would later recount witnessing American pilots enduring fierce anti-aircraft fire as they pressed their attacks. Their bravery, he noted, mirrored that of the samurai, unwavering in the face of almost certain death. Captain Tomichihara, who survived the sinking of the destroyer Yahagi, would reflect on the senselessness of the operation in a moving account. The broader consequences of the battle extended beyond the immediate tactical defeat. The failure of Operation Tango meant that Japanese forces would be deprived of naval support during the crucial defense of Okinawa. Had Yamato successfully reached the shores of the island, it is possible that the already staggering American casualties, over 50,000, could have been far worse. The impact of Yamato's destruction reached into the planning of future military campaigns. If Japan was willing to sacrifice its last remaining battleship in such a desperate, suicidal mission, it raised significant questions about what the Japanese would be willing to do to defend their homeland. This mindset would be a contributing factor in the eventual decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan 4 months later.
The bomb was partly justified by the belief that Japan would accept an infinite number of casualties rather than surrender. In 1985, the wreck of the Yamato was discovered. The remains of the battleship were found split into two primary sections at a depth of 340 meters. The bow section, still upright, bore the emblem of the chrysanthemum crest, while the stern had been obliterated by the explosion of its magazines. Modern investigations revealed that the ship had suffered between 11 and 13 torpedo strikes and 6 to 8 bomb hits. However, the most devastating blow came from the torpedoes that struck the port side, causing extensive flooding that proved impossible to contain. Veterans of the battle would meet again in 1985 at reunions, bringing together men who had once fought as enemies. Survivors of the Yamato met with the American pilots who had launched the fatal attacks on the battleship. In these encounters, the Japanese veterans acknowledged the mission's futility from the start, while the American pilots expressed admiration for the courage of the Japanese sailors who knew they were sailing on a one-way journey. These emotional reunions underscored the deep respect that had developed between former adversaries despite the nature of their conflict. The Yamato's legacy is now honored in the memorial at Kure, Japan, where the ship was constructed. This site has become a pilgrimage for many, attracting thousands of visitors annually. The Japanese come to pay their respects to the men who made the ultimate sacrifice, while Americans visit to better understand their former enemies. The museum located there emphasizes the importance of peace, reminding visitors of the devastating cost of war. The cultural portrayal of the battle has contributed to shaping the public memory, with the 2005 Japanese film Yamato depicting the crew's sacrifice as both heroic and ultimately pointless. Both the Japanese and American perspectives offer valuable insights into the nature of the battle. It was, in many ways, a tragedy for the men who perished, yet it also stands as a testament to the evolution of military strategy and technology. This complex story, filled with individual acts of bravery and strategic significance, continues to resonate as a powerful reminder of the harsh realities of war. The environmental impact of the wreck of the Yamato endures to this day. Approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil remain trapped inside the ship's hull, leaking into the ocean at a slow but persistent rate. Despite its status as a war grave, protected by international agreements, the wreck continues to release pollutants into the marine ecosystem. This tragic legacy serves as a sobering reminder of the long-lasting consequences of war, both on the environment and human life. The Battle of Okinawa, in which the Yamato was sunk, remains a critical subject of study in military and historical circles. Educators around the world often use it as a case study to discuss key lessons in air superiority, the risks of relying on outdated tactics, and the immense human cost of refusing to acknowledge defeat. One of the central lessons from the battle is the danger of adhering too rigidly to outdated military doctrines. The Japanese forces were operating with strategic concepts that had become ineffective in the face of rapidly advancing technology and tactics. Operation Tenno, which sought to bring the Yamato into the fray despite its vulnerability, is often cited as an example of how institutional pride can cloud judgment, leading to decisions that ultimately result in disaster.
A closer examination of the attack reveals the sophistication of the American approach. Far from being a chaotic clash, the assault on the Yamato was a meticulously coordinated operation. Torpedo bombers approached from carefully calculated angles to maximize the chances of a successful strike. Dive bombers were tasked with targeting the ship's communication and fire control systems, while fighters suppressed anti-aircraft defenses in a series of timed attacks. The operation's success was built not on raw power, but on precise, well-planned coordination. Weather conditions also played a critical role in the battle's outcome. Low cloud cover forced American aircraft to fly at lower altitudes, making them vulnerable to enemy anti-aircraft fire, but also provided cover for the torpedo bombers, whose attacks were less predictable and harder to intercept. Rain squalls further obscured the attackers' movements, making it harder for the Yamato's defenses to react. On top of that, rough seas severely hampered the ability of the ship's crew to control damage as it was inflicted, complicating efforts to keep the vessel operational. Compounding these challenges were communication failures within the Japanese forces. Early in the engagement, the Yamato's radio antennas were destroyed, rendering the ship unable to communicate effectively. In addition, the ship's flag signals were obscured by smoke, further hindering attempts to coordinate responses. This breakdown in communication hastened the collapse of organized resistance, leaving the ship and its crew without effective leadership or coordination as the battle raged on. The leadership styles of the key figures involved in the battle provide further insight into the nature of the conflict. Admiral Miter, in charge of the operation, made the decision to launch the Yamato into battle without awaiting formal orders, acting on his own initiative and without clear coordination. In contrast, Captain Ito, who commanded the Yamato, followed orders, despite having personal doubts about the feasibility of the mission. Rear Admiral Eruga, who was responsible for overseeing the defense, executed his duties without hesitation, even as the situation grew increasingly dire. Each of these decisions, made within the constraints of their roles, played a part in the eventual outcome of the battle.
Today, the wreck of the Yamato lies in the depths of the East China Sea, a silent monument to the lives of the 4,137 Japanese sailors who perished aboard her, as well as the 12 Americans who lost their lives in the attack. The massive guns of the ship are silent, and her once proud hull now rests in pieces. The battle may be long past, but its lessons continue to resonate, particularly in how they illuminate the nature of warfare and the human costs of conflict. The destruction of the Yamato signaled more than just the end of an era for battleships. It marked the beginning of a deeper understanding of war's true nature. The failure of Operation Tengo underscored the futility of engaging in combat based on obsolete strategies and concepts. Despite the tactical objectives not being met, the operation's legacy lies in its demonstration of the dangers of pride and outdated thinking in military strategy. This ultimate lesson, written in the blood of those who fought and died, endures as a stark warning about the consequences of war. The Yamato's final service to humanity, though a tragic one, remains an enduring testament to the costs of war and the importance of adapting strategies to meet the realities of the battlefield. This lesson continues to echo across the decades, reminding us of the need to constantly reevaluate and adapt our understanding of warfare, lest we repeat the mistakes of the past.
The evidence is unequivocal. The trucks provided by the United States were not merely helpful, they were indispensable. The vehicles, which Soviet soldiers nicknamed Zakhodnik for their ability to traverse any terrain, became as vital to the Red Army's success as the T-34 tanks that dominate war memorials. Without these trucks, supply lines could not have been maintained, and entire operations could have stalled. This historical episode demonstrates broader lessons about information, power, and memory. It shows how authoritarian regimes can manipulate collective recollection, prioritizing ideological narratives over factual truth. Yet it also highlights how genuine evidence eventually emerges, even after decades of obfuscation. The logistical backbone of the Soviet war effort, the American trucks, stands as a testament to the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare. In total, 427,284 trucks crossed the Atlantic and traversed the vast Soviet landscape to supply troops, transport artillery, and maintain momentum against the German army. These vehicles represent more than a sum of mechanical parts. They are symbols of the United States' industrial strength and of a form of international cooperation that transcended ideology. The Soviet generals' later acknowledgement that their victory depended on this support underscores a simple but profound truth. Strategic success in war relies as much on material resources as on courage and strategy. The Studebaker trucks, many of which remained in service for decades after the war, outlasted the propaganda that sought to erase them from history. Veterans, surviving records, and archival research collectively affirm that without these American vehicles, the Red Army's triumph in Berlin might have remained out of reach. In a historical irony, the United States supplied the machinery that strengthened the very power which would deny that contribution for nearly half a century. Yet, as with the reliable engines themselves, historical truth endures. The conclusion is clear. Soviet victory in the Second World War was inseparable from American logistical support. It was not merely the heroism of soldiers, but the integration of bravery with industrial output that determined the outcome. The wheels of democracy literally carried the Red Army to triumph, and history now rightly records that reality.